Oh, and there's Viva. So I've just clicked on the recording. Like I said, my name is Dr. Joshua Lundy Whitler, and I've had the pleasure of welcoming you all here. We are moving towards the end of the year here with our webinar series for ALUM, the Association of Leaders of Lifelong Learning for Ministry. We are an organization that serves as a network for people who are involved in lifelong learning for ministry, as you might figure. A very diverse group of theological educators and program directors and designers and consultants and coaches and all of those things. And we've been networking people together for those purposes for almost 60 years now, and have taken a variety of different forms. And we are looking forward to taking some new forms and new directions here in the future with some new partnerships and new directions. We have a great coaching cohort program that's led by Dr. Sarah Erickson, who's here. And Joanne BC from ATS is here. So we'll let her into the room, which is lovely. And it's just great to see you all here. For whatever reasons that you come here, whether you're involved in lifelong learning specifically, or if you're curious about the subject, about clergy care, we're very excited to have you here and to be a part of this conversation. We're pleased to welcome Reverend Dr. Thad Austin and Dr. Katie Comeau.
Yes, Comeau.
I'm sorry, I apologize. I got a little, I'm terrible with names. Well, we're very thankful to have both of you here for this webinar discussing the research that you all have been working on and the new book that just came out with the study results that have been in the works for many years now, Caring for Clergy, Understanding a Disconnected Network of Providers. So there's a lot to be discussed in terms of how this relates to lifelong learning, as well as the challenges that ministers face and clergy face, and how those of us who are working with clergy and ministers can best resource and move towards the future together with those who are charged to lead these communities. And so many of you were at the conference earlier this month with them, and so you have kind of a taste of what this is already looking like, but we look forward to having some more in-depth conversations today. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn it over to Thad and Katie, and again, welcome so much for being here. There we are.
Wonderful. You all seeing that all right? Okay, fantastic. Again, just as Joshua mentioned, my name's Thad Austin. I'm so pleased to be here with my colleagues, Dr. Katie Comeau and also Patrick Gorman. We're going to be talking to you today a little bit about the research that we have conducted over the past year and a half to really examine the support network that is available to clergy, and for which continuing education and lifelong learning play a very substantive role. If you'd like to learn more about our research, I'll just commend to you the web address that you see here on the screen, caringforclergybook.com. If you go there, you can download our first chapter for free. You can kind of have an overview of all the chapters. But in addition to doing some kind of more formal presentation over our time together, we're also interested in some conversation. We're interested in hearing from you about your experiences and learning from you as well. So I'll go ahead and dive in, tell you a little bit about the type of research that we have been conducting, to give you a bit of an overview for that. And then I'm going to turn things over in a few minutes to my colleague, Patrick Gorman, who will give a bit of an overview of some of the historical narration of this particular field of lifelong learning and in particular, continuing education. So there are many different avenues of caring for clergy. As you have likely seen from the cover of our book, we've been using kind of a biblical analogy of Moses, Aaron, and Hur, thinking about the ways that clergy are supported. But we know that there are other biblical analogies that we could draw on, whether it be the sometimes underappreciated role Martha and the story of Martha and Jesus, or others that might come to you about the way in which religious leaders are cared for. There are many ways that clergy are cared for today, and we've been interested primarily in understanding the systemic structures that are in place to care not just for an individual clergy person, but for many clergy. Now, I do need to say just at the outset here that the most impactful way that clergy will ever be cared for or supported is at the local level. I served in local pastoral ministry for more than a decade. And if you've been around me long enough, you've probably heard the story of a couple that met me with the moving truck when I was moving into the parsonage. And that couple did more for me in the first 6 months of my ministry than anybody that I'm about to talk about. That being said, that couple had only a direct impact on me. And we have been thinking about, instead of just the local support, what are those systemic structures that are in place? We believe that there are denominational officials, as well as networks and associations, especially in non-denominational contexts, that are incredibly important. There are funders. These can be private family foundations or large-scale foundations. You might think of groups like the Lilly Endowment, the Duke Endowment, Murdoch Charitable Trust, among others. There are pension benefit and insurance officers that play an important role in the care and support of clergy. So you might think about, for the Methodist, the West Path Benefits and Investment, but you could also think about the Board of Pensions for the PCUSA or Portico. There's a whole host of different denominationally affiliated pension benefit boards that provide large-scale support to clergy. But then there are groups like Brotherhood Mutual, which is the second largest insurer of clergy and picks up all of the non-denominational folks that aren't otherwise covered under denominational pension benefit plans. Then there are frontline providers. For us, this is the group that typically works one-on-one with clergy, but they do so at scale. So these are retreat center providers, spiritual directors, counselors, coaches. There's a whole variety of different individuals, licensed clinical social workers, who are part of that particular constellation. And then finally, we come to continuing education providers, which are incredibly important. And I'll just extend my thanks to Joanne Deasy, who's on this call, for the inspiration for really beginning to think about your particular service and vocation as a very core entity that connects to and provides support for clergy at scale. When I was talking with Joanne, she said that in her work through the Association of Theological Schools, that oftentimes that when a clergy person gets to a dry point in his or her ministry, their first call is not always to that spiritual director, counselor, coach, or retreat center provider, but instead they might do something like sign up for a Doctor of Ministry program, or perhaps another form of continuing education. And so we believe that continuing education providers are also incredibly important to this constellation of providers as well. So through our research, we have been interested in investigating three major themes. The first is the organization of these different providers. So how are they organized, just from a descriptive standpoint? Where are they located? Another question that we've had is in terms of conceptualization. So how is it that they think about their particular work? How do they think about things like what constitutes clergy well-being, as an example? And how do they understand their place within this larger constellation of providers, this larger network as well? And then the third major theme is in terms of activity. So what is actually taking place? What are these providers offering from just a practical standpoint? So my two colleagues and I conducted a large-scale national study, primarily here in the United States, although we did have some representation from some parts of Canada. And here on the screen, you'll see the geographic distribution of our respondents. Those that are in the maroon color, those that have completed our survey, and those that are in the blue color are those that have not completed our survey. We feel very good about the geographic representativeness of the different populations that we surveyed across those different sectors that I just told you about a few minutes ago. In addition, our respondents, about half are evangelical and about half are mainline. We did have a few Roman Catholic respondents that took the survey, although we didn't specifically reach out to them. We think that there's likely, there's a study like this worthy to be done within the Roman Catholic tradition or even in the Greek Orthodox tradition. But we thought that there was enough variety within Protestantism that we wanted to just try to get our hands and our minds around what was happening within the Protestant structures. So you'll see here that we've got a pretty good representation. We had a 47% response rate to our survey. We feel very confident about the results because of the theological variety, the variety of sectors that are represented in our analysis that you'll hear about in a few minutes, as well as where they fall on all those different types of spectra. So that's a little bit about some of the methods that we have engaged, but I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Patrick Gorman, and he's going to talk with us for a few minutes just about the history of continuing education.
Yeah, so thanks, Thad. I'm going to give just a very broad brush overview of the history of higher education in general in America, and then get into some of the kind of current context, if you will. So like most tales of the story of higher education in America, I'll begin with Harvard University. As in its founding, it was created to advance learning for clergy, to not leave an illiterate ministry. And so we see this take place all over the country with or the colonies, if you will, actually, as they start to recognize the need to educate their ministers. So many of this beginning schools, seminaries, and colleges are intended to train clergy. And so with this in mind, in 1750, about half of all American students in college were preparing for ministry. But then over time, this shifted and dropped steadily over the next 150 years, so that by 1900, only about 6.5% of all students were studying religion or entering into ministry in higher education. And this number decreased even as the number of opportunities for higher education increased, that more people were able to attend higher education institutions, and it was opened to a broader segment of the population. We see in the early 1800s, the opening of what are called female seminaries, which originally were meant to train domestic skills and etiquette. But then by 1850, they shifted to training in literacy and reading, and opened up opportunities for women to actually enter into fields beyond the home. And so actually by 1850, women's and men's literacy are at equal levels, in part because of the contribution of these female seminaries. And then as this continued, these seminaries expanded in their purpose and gave women, prepared women for usefulness, as they called it, in building the kingdom of God beyond the home. And so actually in 1876, we see that Anna Oliver is the first woman to receive a Bachelor of Divinity degree. This is the equivalent of today's Master of Divinity. And so as this continues, more women are being ordained in a number of denominations, and eventually, like into the 20th century, we see women being given full status and rights in a lot of the denominations as ordained clergy. also in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War, we see the development of HBCUs. And according to the history that I am taking from, written by Travis Alberton, and I can share his article with you if you're interested, he wrote that in the wake of the Civil War, predominantly white and predominantly Black churches pooled their money together to create these institutions that would become the historically Black colleges and universities. And their primary goal was to uplift and support the African American population in the country, but teaching clergy was still an important goal, although secondary to this primary goal of uplifting African Americans. And through the development of these HBCUs, we see a number of conferences and gatherings for Black clergy, including the Hampton University Ministers Conference, which began in 1914, played a significant role during the civil rights movement and continues to be a highly influential gathering today. So getting back to the year 1900, prior to World War I, divinity school funding equaled or surpassed the funding of other professional programs at universities. But as the world changed and other professional programs quickly opened up opportunities, were given funding, and veterans were returning from war and given grants and opportunities to attend professional schools, all of these other professional programs quickly outgrew divinity school programming in terms of both enrollment and funding. And so this continued. And then in 1960, this is when Connolly Gamble Jr. marks the beginning of the continuing education field as its own field. In his 1975 address to the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry, he wrote that this was 1960 was the turning point year for a number of reasons, including that it was formally recognized as a field by the Library of Congress, and that it began a lot of the surveys conducted by the National Council of Churches and the Association of Theological Schools into the continuing education field for clergy. Important antecedents to this were, of course, the Chautauqua movement, the early summer institutes at universities, both public and theological schools, and the clinical pastoral education program. But it wasn't until 1960 when the continuing education field really grew into its own and was actually just increasing in popularity rapidly. So into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we see the development of a number of networks, new degree programs, including the Doctor of Ministry degree and the accreditation of that degree. We see interest just peaking in general in the idea of continuing education. And we see how new networks and field education training for clergy open up. We see experiential training for clergy. We see other networks besides the Society for Advancement of Continuing Education for Ministry. We see the Association for Doctor of Ministry Education, among others. But then we see a decline in seminary funding and enrollment in that time period around the 1980s and 90s. And this leads to a lot of need to merge with other institutions to survive for many of these seminaries. In response, organizations like SACM, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, I'm sorry, but merge or rebrand into Alum, they come up with new innovative approaches, and they've decided to kind of what I'm calling this second wave, change who they're targeting with their programming, how they're delivering that programming. We see funding from granting foundations like the Lilly Endowment, Inc., encouraging the development of new innovative approaches to continuing education. This includes the most obvious right now is online learning and hybrid programs, which we can't seem to escape now. And so also providing funding to strengthen existing programs. And so this is kind of where I see we are at this moment.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. And so now that you've got kind of an orientation towards your own history, what we'd like to do is we'd like to hear from you. And so if you'll take out your cell phone and if you will scan the QR code that you see here on the screen, we're going to ask you just a couple of questions to engage in some conversation. And then that is going to lead us towards a breakout room experience that we'll do here in just a few minutes. But I want to just provide you a minute or so here to scan the QR code that is there on your screen. And if you don't mind, just to make sure that everybody is on board and we've got everything set up, if maybe you can just give me a quick thumbs up on to make sure that you're logged on with your device. Thank you so much, Misha. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, Joanne. Wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. All right. So the first question that we've got here for you is just simply, what organization do you represent? We want to make sure the technology is working before we engage in something a little bit more substantive. I think that a number of you have been able to post already. But so we've got some folks from Lexington Theological ATS, the Academy of Ministry, Missio Seminary, Church X. Okay. All right. And now let's ask a next question here. I'm curious, if you look back at your device, what is the purpose of providing continuing education for clergy? So what are the goals or outcomes that you hope to achieve? And here, what we're thinking about is beyond just simply instruction. What's the purpose that you're actually working towards for continuing education related to clergy? Wow, this is wonderful. And I think that oftentimes we get focused on the task at hand, and sometimes we forget the larger purpose that our work is really a part. And so just to read off a few, is I know you all we're connecting clergy, we're expanding theological imagination, providing new skills, we're reinvigorating, providing the context and the tools to create thriving communities. We are about growth and relevance, about providing vision, a manifestation of the gospel. Come on, I love it. Emergence of God's kingdom, relationships, These are absolutely wonderful. All right. And then I'm also curious, if you will look back at your device, what challenges do you face in providing continuing education programs or services to clergy? What are the places where you get frustrated or you experience a challenge? So finances, attendance is another common theme I'm seeing. Institutional inertia. Some of the times the clergy are already burned out by the time that they reach your care. Stunted imaginations, and I would have, if I can read into that, I wonder if it's not only within some of the clergy you serve, but also within some of the institutional context. I'm seeing a few nodding heads. Generating interest, prioritizing. Yeah, a lot of the responses about time, I think, are also about time and money are both about priorities. And then also about reaching our audiences as well. Wonderful. All right, one more question for you, and then we're going to spend some time in our breakout rooms, just kind of diving into some of these a little bit, and then we're going to come back and hear a little bit more from our results, what we've discovered from our national study. So you've talked to us a little bit about some of the challenges and frustrations that you experience. Well, what have you found to be effective in overcoming those challenges? What are the effective solutions that overcome those challenges and barriers? And if you don't have something from your own experience, maybe use your imagination. What could help to overcome? All right, fantastic. So partnerships, making sure that the content is immediately applicable. So it's not just theoretical. This is something you actually put into practice. Having vision and creativity and innovation, reducing the cost. So actually reducing the barriers to entry related to cost and also time, making sure that there is a priority. Language, flexibility, financial assistance, input from clergy. I love this. This is going to be a theme we're going to come back to that Dr. Comeau is going to talk a little bit about, actually the importance of listening to the clergy that we're serving. Dialoguing, I think, is connected with that. Having virtual options, having a permissive boss does help quite a bit. I would love to find out how to get one of those. If you do have any suggestions in that regard, I'd love to hear those. Wonderful, and then also tailored to needs, subsidized cost. That's great. Okay, so we're going to go into some breakouts. We're going to be talking about the challenges and the solutions that you all have put in here. We'll spend about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes in our breakouts, and then we'll come back. You'll hear a little bit about our research, and we'll be happy to engage in some dialogue after that. So Joshua, go ahead and send us out.
not the most significant. They were not the most significant barrier. It was actually the time commitment, because we couldn't give it away in some cases.
Seems like some people have had similar experiences with that, for sure. Any others on the challenges?
I was going to share. So I am one of the program directors at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. And we we are offering a fellowship for clergy and lay leaders to do interfaith work. And then we also provided a micro grant for them to do some type of service learning that brings their congregations together. And I was just thinking kind of what you said, Daryl, as far as like, so we had the money, they didn't have to pay anything to be a part of the fellowship. But I think for me, the biggest learning was priority. And so how do you actually come alongside clergy to say, this isn't like an extra thing that you're doing outside of what you're already doing? And so even now, as we are, getting another cohort together, we're thinking more about how can we make sure that this fellowship is actually supporting the work that they're already doing, so it doesn't feel like such a burden on their time or just one extra thing they have to do. And so kind of to your point, Daryl, like you might even have the money, but you still have to think about timing and also can they realistically prioritize this? So.
Yeah, and that communication piece, that it's an integral part of their ministry to engage in this too. So
exactly.
Self-care, and that they also want to prioritize that as well. So
yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I want to jump in. One of the experiences, I'm Doris Garcia, and actually I'm in Puerto Rico, and I'm working remote with Lexington Theological Seminary. One thing that I have found in terms of continuing education is that it helped us when I was here in Puerto Rico at the Evangelical Seminary to kind of touch base with the denominations and the pastors to know what they need, and then tailor the courses on what they need. Though, however, sometimes the pastors also ask for things that are kind of way beyond what we could give as a seminary. So we negotiate. For example, one thing that we were surprised, but it's part of the context, of the changing context, is that they were asking us for project management. You know, having more bivocational pastors, and the congregations, you know, being diminishing greatly. So what tools they needed to provide for projects, for funding, for the church or for themselves. So that key element of project management became one thing that we tried to provide in one of the continuing education courses, and that really was very successful.
Cool, that's awesome. Great. Well, thank you for sharing some of those stories. Next, maybe we can talk about some of the solutions that we have found effective, or that we hope to be able to find effective. Yeah, what are some stories that you all have come across? Okay. I don't think we can hear you. For some reason.
Is it a Bluetooth issue?
Oh.
No
Okay.
problem.
Anybody
Yeah.
else?
I'll go as Tay's getting his his things together. So I think during the pandemic, of course, we've all had to go online. We all had to use Zoom. And I feel like now that we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, you know, clergy are still like, hey, the Zoom option helps because I don't have to leave my office. I can just kind of tune in. And so I think that has been very helpful when we speak of like the timing piece. If people don't have to necessarily drive anywhere, they can still kind of, you know, be a part of the programming with the convenience of, you know, doing it at home or even just staying in their office. So that has been, I feel like, a solution for us.
Cool, that's awesome. Yeah, just also being able to connect with clergy across the nation or, you know, internationally as well. We do hear, I mean, part of the challenge too is if you're in more rural areas where there isn't the internet access, that can complicate things a little bit further, but you know, those always little challenges in the midst of everything to continue working on. Thank you. Yeah. Hey.
Yeah, no, it works. Sorry for that, guys. I could hear you all fine, so I assumed that the microphone thing was working, but it obviously wasn't. Yeah, so Tate Moss up here in Toronto, Canada. One of the things that I've noticed, though, is that, you know, yes, the shift to Zoom was very helpful for a lot of people and made a lot of things more accessible. But there's a step beyond that, which we need to take as well, which is making stuff accessible, like in an asynchronous way, for example. And because a lot of people, you know, making a Zoom appointment at a certain time in a certain place is also burdensome, right? It may be easier than attending an in-person meeting, but, you know, there's these kind of steps. And, you know, a lot of the content that I've also seen deployed via Zoom tends to, frankly, be fairly shallow, right? Because there's only so much you can do in like a 1 hour session with people. And what you really need for them to do is to do some reading and come back for a discussion and then do some reading and, you know, that kind of a pedagogy. And a lot of our programs just really aren't built to sustain that just yet. But I'm working on it myself, but it's, you know, it's one of these things that I think we need to continue to work on as a community of educators.
So do you find that you're offering more asynchronous options or about half?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. No, we're actively developing a bunch of asynchronous content. And like we have one that's been pretty popular on how to build good church teams. Mm-hmm. And it was one of these things that was originally designed for in-person delivery. And the two people that did it, they had been doing it for like more than 10 years. And they didn't have an outline or a PowerPoint deck or anything. And so, you know, the instructional designer who worked with me, who worked with them, her first question was, well, what do you do with these people? You know? And they said, oh, the first thing we do is we introduce ourselves. Great, okay. First learning activity, introductions. What's the second thing you do with them? Oh, we start asking them questions about, you know, leadership in the Bible. Okay, great. You know, and so there was a lesson plan there, but it was kind of in their heads, right? And so we were able to develop it and tease it out and to create something that, you know, we can argue about whether it's as effective as the in-person gathering would be. It might not be as effective, but it's something that people can do, right? And it's effective in its own way, perhaps. So.
Yeah, don't sacrifice the good for the perfect kind of thing. If it's making an improvement, that's definitely something better. We have time for one more if anybody wants to share, or, you know, if there's something that they hope for in their work that they'd like to see.
Yeah, I have wrestled with the balance between a rigorous asynchronous interaction that provides content and pedagogy versus the bar of technology required to access it. I found a lot of clergy are not tech savvy, and that's a real barrier for some of them.
Yeah, that's true. Along with the content of the education, also the skill in you accessing it too.
Yeah. The other piece of it that we've been talking about a lot as a group has been accessibility with technology, how it's increased that and how it actually helps us engage different kinds of learners. But conversely, it can also exclude certain kinds of learners as well. And that can go along with both because people are less technologically savvy and also because of different versions, whether learning styles or perhaps if people are neurodivergent persons, then there can be a difference as well. So we're actually going to have a seminar next month to talk about that particular. We have somebody coming in to discuss that particular issue and how continuing educators can work on those kinds of issues. So, but that's something that I think that has been an interesting conversation of how people have overcome working with different types of people, and again, the blessings and the opportunities, but also the potential pitfalls of online education. So,
Yeah, cool, great, thanks for sharing.
It's telling to me, like, you know, I've been dealing with a lot of help requests, you know, from people. So I'm really getting a sense of like what the technological challenges are. And as a system architect and system administrator and so forth, for the learning management system, I thought that like the difference in like font size was what was going to be what mattered, right? Or like the certain things about how the interface is set up for ease of use. But no, like 90% of the problems they're running into are people forgetting their username and password. You know, it's like the really basic stuff, you know, or people who, like, I was talking to a lady who was just struggling because, and I asked her at a certain point, and she just let me know that, oh, my daughter usually does all my online stuff for me. And it's because she was struggling even to like enter a credit card to do a transaction, like was like, she kept making typos in the number and not understanding how it wasn't going through. You know, like, you know, it took like an hour with her, you know, on the phone to sort of get the basics. And I'm like, when's your daughter coming by again? You know, like, you know, but you know, it was kind of tough because she was trying to sign up for a mandatory training that was necessary for certification. And it's like I called the program director person who's kind of in charge of that curriculum, and I said, I don't know what to tell you, but you know, if she's going to be doing this ministry and she has to be qualified for this course, then you might need to call her on the phone and have her just listen on the phone or something, because I'm not confident she's going to figure out Zoom, you know, to do this mandatory misconduct prevention training, you know. But should she be excluded from doing ordained ministry because she can't manage Zoom, right?
Cool, great. Well, Josh, I think we're ready to head back. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. That was great. We'll see you back. We have the other breakout room coming.
they have a 90 seconds grace period. So
Great, thank you.
yeah. Looks like people are finishing up. I think Thad just rejoined us. Yep.
All right.
People are coming in.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
All right, let's get this here. Let me see, trying to find the right screen. There we go. All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing in your breakouts. Hope that was helpful just to kind of brainstorm. We're really trying to orient you, to ground you historically to some of the unique challenges and opportunities that came as we look backwards, but then also to think about how those are particularly relevant today as well. What can we learn from the past? And also how can we engage for the future as well? We're going to talk with you a little bit about our research, and I'm going to give you a bit of a kind of large scale overview to some of the core findings that are the major headlines, but then we're going to quickly turn to some more specific analysis that Dr. Comeau is going to provide for us that is specifically relevant to the continuing education and lifelong learning space. If you have read the subtitle of our book, so it's Caring for Clergy, subtitle then is Understanding a Disconnected Network of Providers. we did not do a very good job of hiding the main point here. What we find is that the different sectors that we talked about earlier, those different providers of support for clergy, are deeply siloed. And this happens either from a denominational or theological tradition. So maybe all the Presbyterians are having a conversation, and all the Methodists and all the Baptists and all the Assemblies of God, they're having separate conversations, not together. They're not engaged. And so what does that mean? Well, when there is an innovation, it's not shared widely. When there's a problem, you don't have as many people to call upon to be able to kind of crowdsource the solution. So the silos happen either based on denominational or theological tradition, or based upon the specific sector. So for instance, we are in a continuing education space right now. We've got some great collaboration happening across different institutions within the theological education space. But as an example, the Board of Pensions for the PCUSA is probably one of the largest continuing education providers for the denomination. And they're not represented in this conversation. You see what I'm saying? So we can get very siloed based upon either the denominational or theological tradition, or based upon the specific sector in which we exist. That can sometimes lead to some echo chambers as well. So we were interested in understanding how specifically this network might be visualized. So in our survey, we asked a basic question: with whom do you partner? And we did a network analysis of the results. This is the way the large-scale structures that are available for clergy within Protestant North America, within America primarily, this is the way they look. Now, obviously, we've not captured every single connection, but we've captured the most important connections for our respondents. And what you'll see here is a loosely affiliated network of providers from different denominational, theological traditions. But what shocked us was when we zoomed out from this core that is in some way in conversation, look at all of these other entities that are on the edge, that have no meaningful connection whatsoever to what's happening at the center. So even if there is an important conversation that's taking place at the core, that is not happening along the edges. One more thing I'll just mention here quickly about this particular model. We have only captured those that have partnerships. So if you were to actually zoom out one more level, there would be all of these individual dots that aren't connected to anyone. We created two different models. One you just saw. And if you take any one of those nodes and you move it, it has no meaningful impact on any of the other nodes that are around it. We created a second model, which basically just adds one additional connection to each of these different providers. So it's more densely connected. And when you move any one of those nodes, the whole system begins to dance. So what would it be like if we were in better conversation, in better collaboration together? How might that impact the care that we are providing to the clergy that we serve? So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Comeau, and she's going to walk us through some of the analysis that undergirds that large-scale headline that you heard about.
Great, thanks. Yes, one of our values in doing this research was creating connections among collaborators, across the sectors, within the sectors, for the purpose, one, just to not feel alone in the challenges that we all shared earlier, and also to work together to create solutions and to implement them like we shared earlier. So I'm going to present a few findings from our research that I think will resonate with you, because a lot of what we heard from other continuing education providers is similar to what you just shared. I'll just note at the outset that when we talk about the continuing education sector in this analysis, it's including anybody who selected that they provide some form of continuing education to clergy. So that could include a director of a retreat center who's providing some sort of workshop that they consider as continuing education, but also, a lot of people working within seminaries in other spaces like you all. So first we'll start with the conceptualization piece. So how are continuing education providers and other providers defining well-being and thinking about it in terms of what it means for their own work? We were most interested in, for the purpose of connection, are they speaking a similar language of what clergy well-being means to them? And so we weren't looking for like a single definition of clergy well-being, but we wanted to understand, are they using similar terms? And we saw in our research that some similar terms were being used in different ways, which could create some difficulty in understanding each other if they're both talking about holistic well-being, but meaning it in different ways. So for some providers, like pension benefits and insurance providers, holistic might mean more the financial or the physical aspects of clergy well-being, whereas for continuing education providers, it'll be more of the spiritual aspects of clergy well-being. And we can see this in the next slide as well, when you look at the top 3 well-being concepts for the different sectors. So on one end of the spectrum, we have the continuing education providers who cite spiritual well-being. They are involved in the theological training of clergy. So spiritual well-being is really important for them, that clergy have a grasp of the theology that they need to minister to their congregations well. But financial well-being, not as much. And with education that a lot of clergy have, that, and we have talked about in the challenges, that could be something where collaboration could work with the pension benefits and insurance sector to collaborate on the financial well-being of clergy. So on the next slide then too, so besides just the conceptualization well-being, how does that then affect the needs that providers are actually addressing? So we found that with the continuing education providers in our sample, that they are 3 times more likely to care for spiritual health. And importantly, they are 2 times more likely to care for the clergy person's social life than the full sample. And we find that to be important because across the sectors, providing for the relational well-being of clergy was the most challenging thing to focus on. They're more focused on mental and emotional health or spiritual health, and not the relationships that clergy have that keep them sustained in their ministry. But even though they are the sector that's most likely to care for the social life of the clergy person, still only less than 40% of the seminaries actually provide care for that clergy person's social life. So we'll come back in the Q&A a little bit later and I'd like you to think about what are some ways that you are caring for the clergy person's social life. So next, we were interested in, do you actually have some goals in your work in caring for clergy? And particularly with formal goals. So continuing education providers, 78% of them do have formal goals, and that's roughly similar to the full sample. And we also found that they obtain regular feedback to inform those goals much more often than any other sector, which, actually having clergy input in the goals is very important. So you can also talk about that a little bit later in terms of how you all are incorporating feedback from clergy as well. So these are the top 3 goals that we identified in our research. So improving the health and well-being, improving ministry effectiveness for the clergy, and being able to provide more education opportunities to clergy as well. The least cited goals was increasing more awareness of their programs and increasing the number of clients and pastors that they serve. And then these are a few of the quotes to kind of illustrate these goals. So for the health, we envision restored Christian leaders who are equipped to foster spiritual, emotional, and relational health. For ministry, that students will engage tools for deepening and reinvigorating their vocational callings. And then for education, that they will educate, inform creative leaders to minister and serve humanity in a rapidly changing global environment. Great, and I'll pause there. Does anybody have, we'll have some time for Q&A, but any clarifying questions on that section? Great, cool. So the next part, we wanted to know, for all of our providers, what is informing their work? What are the inspirations and the resources that they draw upon time and time again that helps them to know about how they will provide care for clergy? So one of the ways that we went into this was we first conducted your traditional literature review using Google Scholar to locate sources on clergy, ministers, and well-being. And that identified 236 unique resources. And we also asked our participants to provide the resources, the inspirations that informed their work. And that provided 289 unique resources. So of these resources, only 3 overlap between the academic journal articles and the participant resources. So academics are having one conversation on one side, and the participants are relying on a different conversation on another side. We raise this because for many continuing education providers, they operate in both spaces. They're publishing in academic journals, and they're also providers of clergy care and accessing the resources that many of our participants use as well. So we can see some of the different conversations that are happening with the word clouds of the abstracts and the summaries of the participant resources. So on one side for the participants, a lot of, they draw on a lot of work about leadership, ministry, church, the Christian life is very important. And then for academics, they're more focused on burnout and the emotional health and the well-being of clergy, and trying to understand the factors that go into affecting clergy well-being and clergy health. And then we also were interested in some of the specific topics. So just thinking about the person that's being covered for academics, and this is in part due to our methodology, much more emphasizing the clergy, the pastor, minister as the main focus of the research and discussion, whereas for survey participants, again, clergy, pastors, ministers appearing a couple times, 25% of the time, but also much more engagement with just general leadership books, management books, to inform them, or just Christian life. We were maybe not quite surprised that women and communities of color didn't factor in too much, but we just heard from Patrick earlier that women and African-American clergy have been part of the conversation for as long as we've had churches, and so, but they're not there aren't as many resources being engaged there yet. So what can be done to address that gap as well? And then on the next one, if we look at some of the subject, we were surprised that conflict, polarization, and trauma stand out as being very few of the resources that are being covered. And we're surprised by this, just given the last several years. We've had a lot of interest in, we've seen a lot of interest in understanding how trauma affects clergy well-being, but not many resources out there. And also the conflict polarization that many churches are struggling with, but again, not many resources are being accessed by our participants or produced by the academics to address that on the well-being. So again, that raises the question of what role can continuing education providers who straddle both spaces provide in creating more access or availability of these resources. Great. And then, so just wanted to come back to the challenges. So most of what we discussed earlier was also highlighted in our research. So the top challenges were clergy, the lack of finances, lack of time, and the advertisement of programs and services. For the clergy, one of the points that I want to make here, and I think we saw that earlier, is that a lot of times our providers in our survey would talk about how clergy are unwilling or hesitant to access services, but a lot of that is due to some of the structural barriers that they face, and we talked about that a bit earlier. Lack of finances was a key one, and so then we'll go to the next slide. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the spaces of innovation that participants in our survey noticed. One being the changing context, part due to either COVID or some of the new ways of doing church, more bivocational clergy. Our participants noticed that these spaces were key to being able to identify new innovations that could help clergy in lots of different ways. Creating connections is being key, and then also increasing the acceptance of clergy health and well-being. Surprisingly, perhaps, new resources did not appear too much as a frontier or innovation. And this is probably in that accessing different resources isn't really where the innovation lies. It's in identifying ways to address the structural barriers that prevent access to resources that do exist. So I'll stop there and we'll open up for some question and answer time.
Yeah, so we'd love to dialogue with you. If there are any comments or questions that you have, we'd invite you to share those with us. We do have a couple of additional questions we'd love to invite you to think about as well. But first and foremost, want to make sure that you've got what you need. So any comments or questions you've got on anything that you've heard thus far?
I haven't read the book yet, Dad and Katie, and I will. I'm curious to know, because we just had a retreat this past week for our pastors in our Lilly Grant program, and we purposefully invited one of our counselors from Missio Seminary to join us. And my purpose for inviting them was because many of our pastors shy away from, don't bother with counselors. So we had her come to address the stigma of emotional health, things of that nature. So I'm wondering, does your book cover anything about that in terms of the stigma associated with, emotional trauma, whatever it might be? Does the book cover that at all?
Katie, you want to take that first?
Not recalling off the top of my head that we talk about that as much. We have a chapter on some of the challenges that are faced, but we talk about that more in terms of the structural challenges.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
important part of it too.
Right. And one of the things that I just mentioned as well, Valerie, is that there is, we do note in the book that among more evangelical populations, the stigma towards mental health services tends to be a little bit higher. That's what we picked up on as we were going through and during the research. This is also one of the ways in which I would say that a number of clergy might not feel that they have the right ability or access to be able to go to a trusted source. So what does it mean when, just as an example, within one particular denomination that we looked at, the same person who is responsible for the care and support of clergy is also in charge of discipline as well. And so that creates a bit of a conflict of interest when, the person that you can go to offer, help is also the person that is, can negatively impact your life.
Yeah.
The one other thing that comes to my mind is truly in terms of access. So we did a presentation just a week ago with a number of clergy, and we asked them some of the same questions that we're asking you all because we wanted to hear their perspective. And one individual in particular talked about how her denomination offered subsidized counseling services up to a certain number for a family. And it was something like 6 counseling sessions. And what she said was that she has prioritized those for her children coming out of COVID. And so there's nothing really left over for her. So I think that the approach that you've taken in beginning to understand, we ask you, what are your challenges? If we had more time, one of the questions I would be asking you all is what's actually deeper behind. It's okay. What's behind the time? Why don't we have time? Those kind of things. And I think what you're doing is you're understanding some of the assumptions that we may have that are the actual barriers. And so I really commend you for bringing in the mental health professional to talk with the clergy. Other comments or questions that you all have, either about the research or perhaps you might have a comment for Valerie, something you found particularly helpful or effective?
I was trying to take some notes off the slide. Can you speak more about the advertisement? It was under the challenges. I was curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, I think and actually, what you brought up in our breakout session was pretty much that, just the on one, it encompasses both like just the marketing of a program, which comes down to the communication of it, like making it something that clergy understand what it is and that it's a vital that is necessary for them in their work and integral to their ministry. And so really for our participants, seeing the challenge in making their programs and services known to clergy in a way that they can access them and will take access.
Thank you.
As I think about that from my pastoral days, the way I would frame it is, I wish I'd known about that. Well, it was in the bulletin. We announced it from the pulpit. We've done that for 3 weeks straight. If you were here, we sent out an email. It was in the newsletter, all those kind of things. But it's the last mile. Just because you have communicated it doesn't mean that someone else has received it. I remember a number of years ago when I was at Indiana University, I went and heard they brought in a pedagogical expert from France. And he had the most interesting way to begin his talk. He stood in the middle of a kiddie pool and he brought out a large pitcher of water. And he said, "This is the way most of you all teach." And he poured the water out and it totally missed the cup in his other hand. And so water just goes everywhere. And he said, the funny thing about this is the pitcher thinks it did its job, but the water never actually made it into the cup. And so, I think that that's not only important for us to remember when we're teaching, but also even in terms of the way that we are communicating. This is in particular a really important kind of, I think, to know and understand the communication methods that your clergy rely on. So how and in what ways do they receive information? Just because you sent out a mass email doesn't mean that they're part of the click rate, that opened, the open rate number. So how and in what ways are most effective? It might be that the most effective way is a phone call, or it could be that, it's a text message or an Instagram post or whatever it is. But, really understanding who the demographic you're serving is and how they receive information is vitally important.
Yeah, I was also wondering, seeing the word clergy, I'm just curious to know, does it involve missionaries or only pastors?
So some of our providers do also provide care for missionaries. A number of the retreat centers that are, also engaged in this continuing education space, their services are, a lot of them got started wanting to provide something for missionaries to come back to after being abroad. And then, naturally kind of that also led to providing space for pastors wanting some space away too. But we didn't, there were some who exclusively focused on missionaries, and those who they were not included. Yeah, definitely there's some overlap there too.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, as we think about the disconnected network of providers, where we've focused primarily on those who serve in local pastoral ministry within Protestant congregations in the United States and parts of Canada, what would it be like to learn about the helpful methods within the missionary context? So my wife works for an international missions organization, and there is a wonderful gathering that takes place annually. It's called Missio Nexus. And this is a gathering where most of the major missionary agencies come together, as well as the providers. And so walking through and among the different booths that they have is one of the most interesting kind of places, because you're hearing not only how do we care for ministry leaders, but especially those within third culture context that don't feel at home either in their native land, and also aren't quite fully integrated within the place where they're serving as well. So there are certainly some unique needs within the mission context, and we think it would be really helpful for us to learn from them as well.
So yeah, is your book on Amazon, or where can we get it?
So what I'll ask is for either Katie or PJ, if you don't mind, if you'll pop a link in the chat, wherever books are sold is the answer, but certainly it is on Amazon. And you can go to our website, caringforclergybook.com. You can download the first chapter for free, and there's also a link that will take you over to the Amazon site where you can get it real quickly. I have found that this is particularly helpful, especially if you work in the context of a larger team, to actually read this together, because then you begin to see and understand. For instance, like we were saying before, I wonder what kind of connections we could make with other entities. So for instance, we need to reduce the cost of continuing education. Turns out that pension benefit and insurance agencies are really interested in continuing education. They also hold large financial assets. So, and I'm making things up right now, but I'm wondering how and in what ways we might be able to partner together across these different sectors to not only provide more informed care, but also to be more effective and helpful at the end of the day as well. I know, Daryl, you've got your hand up.
So I've got a question for PJ with his research. I'm wondering, to what extent did you look at or consider non-degree programs of formation offered by judicatories? So for example, in the Methodist tradition, the course of study for local pastors predates seminary education. So that was the norm before seminaries ever became the norm. So, in what way does our modern understanding of lifelong learning depend on a norm of degree granting institutions in order to be a foil to what we do? rather than seeing the judicatory formation programs as the norm and actually the degree programs as the exception.
Right. So, I mean, obviously, I had 5 minutes to give you the entire history of continuing education, so I couldn't really get into all of it. But you're right that early on, especially anyone who could, I mean, it was a luxury to be able to actually even go to a degree granting college. I think I saw the number was like by 1750 there were only like 3,000 college graduates in the entire country. So like, or the colonies, I guess you could say. But essentially it was like an extreme luxury for the wealthy elite to be able to have a degree. So you're right that yes, it wasn't like these colleges and universities were actually like all for, and kind of what I was saying, even only, I mean, for us it's not only half, but only half of the people in these universities in 1750 were studying for ministry, even though that was their original purpose. So they were already like being seen to go to support other professional degrees as well. And so I think you're right to say that yes, like there's a lot of other ways that you can go into ministry, and a lot of those were actually probably how the early pastors were trained anyway, because they stayed in their local church and they became local ministers. I know like in the Methodist Church, you can become a local pastor without having to go through the whole ordination process. You don't have to do the same kind of very rigorous kind of steps to become a local pastor. And then that was much more common, I think, now with the way that kind of people move around much more, and there's like just a broader reach of what's expected of pastors too. It might be almost necessary to get a degree to be able to address all of the issues that come up in ministry, and that's kind of why we see it the way it is now. But it wasn't always that way, and I think you're right to point that out.
Yeah, Daryl, the other thing that I'm thinking about is, we kind of started with the American experience, but I did not actually know this until we did the research for this book, that seminary education was not a requirement within the Roman Catholic tradition until after the Protestant Reformation. And the reason was because the Roman Catholics wanted to ensure that folks understood, the one true doctrine of the church, and that they weren't being led astray by these other, kind of forces. I have in my mind this kind of image of the universities of Europe and the ways that they kind of trained ministers. And yet, even in a more historical context, there were very few that were actually being trained. And in fact, it was not a requirement until after the Protestant Reformation, and only then within the Roman Catholic tradition. So I think you're very wise to point out that important feature. And also, I mean, as I know your own interest within the context of thinking about bivocational ministry, how do we provide for those? We're talking about the cost and time. These are two major barriers within bivocational context to being able to seek out more quote unquote traditional or actually degree bearing forms of education. So the ways that we can kind of push those out, I think is a very wise observation. And thank you, Daryl, for the follow-up chat as well. Thank you for that. Yes, Sarah.
And another observation is, there's still this distinction often between a degree granting doctor of ministry, THD, doctor of educational ministry, and the non-degree learning. And as I recall also from Patrick's talk and some research I've done too, is that many institutions have in their missions and goals historically to provide ongoing, so that there were annual symposia and reunions and speakers and so forth. So in many ways, there is I think, an appreciable difference between the motivation for a degree, an advanced degree, non-MDiv, and the lifelong learning forces. They can both serve the same purposes. And I speak from my own experience, getting a degree and then also continuing education. So I think if we are doing both, we need to think of the different motivations and access points for those audiences. And and understand somebody may come into a lifelong learning program and then do a basic degree, and then do another advanced, a DMin, Doctor of Educational Ministry. There are all kinds of avenues, and I think if we collaborate within our network, we can help people see the possibilities and access points differently.
I'm curious, Joshua, would you mind sharing? I know that Daryl said he'd love to hear more, and also Tay, I'd be really interested to hear what you're seeing as well.
Well, I think that I'm just referring back to, it was a recommendation, and this is to my knowledge, and maybe perhaps my information is outdated, but my understanding was that a few years ago, the UCC at a national level recommended moving away from commissioning pastors. But then you're right, but the manual on ministry does provide other avenues, other alternatives, and so I'm not sure how to reconcile that, but I know that I can speak to my conference, which is the Southern New England Conference in the UCC, and there have been I've heard arguments on both sides. There's been a lot of reticence towards commissioning pastors, and in fact, my association, I think my association is still accepting, but I think other associations within the conference are saying, actually, we're not going to commission pastors anymore. Actually, no, the Central Association has stopped commissioning pastors. So that was something I used to do. I used to be a commissioned pastor. So commissioning would be, Daryl asked for clarification. That's just a process for those who are not ordained, who can receive a special commissioning certificate in order to be approved in order to serve in the roles of ministry. So I think for some people the concern is that it might be a way of avoiding some of the more rigorous aspects of it. And so I think some of that's fear-based. I will say that when I was in Southern California in another denomination, I don't know if I should say the name of it, I saw abuses of the commissioning pastor's route, namely people who had a particular theological, hyper-aggressive agenda, and I guess I'll leave it there, who were commissioning pastors at an exorbitant rate, and they were doing it in order to bolster their numbers so that they would have voting members so that they could pass conservative or whatever their ideological agendas were. So I saw another side of it that was different, but by and large, I also, the importance of needing to create alternative routes is I think really, really important as well. And it really what we're talking about is access, but what we really want is access within community and with opportunities for, like, it's not just about gatekeeping or making sure people have the right theology, but it's about going through a good process, whatever that process looks like. And finding alternative means doesn't mean eliminating that process. It means maybe even rethinking or reimagining what that process might be so that it actually is doing what it's supposed to do and is actually maybe thinking along the terms of lifelong learning rather than simply you passed all your classes and now you have a seminary degree. So I think that's, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joshua. I know we are just right at time. Tay, you want to mention something about what you're experiencing?
Just up here in Canada, at least in the Anglican circles, which I'm most familiar with, although I am learning a lot about the United Church up here too, since they're the ones that pay me. So anyway, one of the big trends is toward increasingly using things like the Niagara School of Mission or like other kind of like non-accredited, non-degree programs to do pastoral training for people. There's a lot of pressures that are on bishops to accommodate different life circumstances of potential candidates for ordination, and so they're often, seeing their kind of ways, kind of around it. And so, yeah, to Joshua's point, there's definitely a desire to see kind of more diversity of approaches and a kind of erosion of the assumption that an MDiv is the qualification for ministry. But also there's a recognition of the limitations of the MDiv. I was just in a Facebook conversation today with a colleague in Montreal, and she was talking about how, there's this huge disconnect between the MDiv training, which is actually necessary for ministry, and it may be that the MDiv is necessary scaffolding to get the knowledge to be able to do ministry, but you still have a lot you have to learn, right? And so there's some programs that try to bridge that gap. I know Lily was funding something that was sort of a residency model program for a while. I don't know, I haven't seen the research on how that turned out yet, but I believe it has been published. And then there was a couple other attempts. There's a program called Momentum that was initially in the States, and it's still being run in Canada quite a bit. Like we got the copyright for that and redeveloped the program here, deployed it. So there are some programs that are trying to fill that gap, but that's another felt need.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Last little thing I'll just mention here, just a couple of opportunities to engage. Obviously, the book, we've already mentioned that, and you've got the web address for it. But I also wanted just to mention a few of you were able to come to a gathering that we hosted at Duke University just a couple weeks ago to think about the answer to the underlying problem that we've noted, which is that there are disconnects. It's not that we don't have passion. It's not that we don't have vision. It's not even that we don't have resources or time, but it's rather that we're disconnected. And what would it be like to create a more connected group of providers that were able to more effectively deliver programs and services to help support not just clergy, but also congregations. So if you'd like to kind of take action with that, we'd love to have you join us with the Common Table Collaborative. You can visit our website, which is commontable.network, to learn more. And I'll just mention this here. We asked our participants of that gathering a couple of weeks ago, what could God imagine as a result? If we were to make inroads in this, what could God imagine? And right at the center, collaboration, healing, unity, wellness, transformation, resurrection, creative energy, forgiveness, kingdom advancing, healthy churches, healthier pastors. This is the vision for what we have, and we know that we share that vision with you all. So we want to encourage you. We want to thank you so much for your work, and if there's any way that we can be supportive of you and your ministry, we would love to do that. And so we're just a short email away, and you can reach us. Our contact information is on the website there, caringforclergybook.com, and you can reach out to us there. Joshua, thank you so much for the invitation to come and to join you today.
Yes, thank you all so much, and join me in our we wave to clap, or you can clap however you want to do it. We often is a way of showing our applause and our gratitude. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to drop a little note here in the chat about kind of upcoming stuff for Alum and opportunities to get connected with us and to know more about what we're doing. We have another webinar here on November 8th, specifically about the accessibility of online education, which is sure to be one that many people will find useful. And again, we hope to have continuing conversations with you, Thad, and everybody over your way with Katie and with PJ. And again, thank you all so much. The work that y'all doing is really important. So we continue to want to support each other in this work, and we want to support all of you as well. And so thank you all for being a part of this. And again, hopefully we can continue a conversation together.